All right, good morning, folks, and thank you. Welcome to HexCon 2024. I want to do a super quick audience participation thing. It'll help me later on. So just by a quick show of hands, who here is a cyber professional? They're a cybersecurity professional. Okay, good set of hands. Amongst folks who are here, who works on Team Offence? They're on the offensive side of cybersecurity. And on the defensive side? All right, lots of defensive folks. Thanks, we're going to return to this in a bit. I want to thank the organizers of HexCon for putting on this event and inviting me to speak. It's pretty thankless work in general, and it's got lots of pain. And so we as a community do derive a benefit from this. So consider sending them a small thank you at the end of the event. I also want to thank all of you for coming through on your Saturday. In this day and age, it seems useful to assert that neither my speech or slides were produced by generative AI. I also confess I'm delivering it with a touch of nerves, but not for the reason you might think. It's not the public speaking part. I'm quite comfortable with that. The old chestnut about imagine your audience naked. Well, let's just say I have a wild imagination. About 20 years ago, I sat next to Dominic White at an academic conference not too far away from here. And we sat in there at a keynote, and we listened to a keynote by an internationally acclaimed professor, full professor, who flew in from the US to deliver that keynote. And in that keynote, he was walking through some of the major aspects of cybersecurity history. And at one point in his slides, he hit a point and he started talking about SRA. I don't know if that, does it ring a bell? Doesn't ring a bell, no. He was talking about SRA, and we had no idea what he was talking about. And he sort of mentioned this in the context of cryptography, and ultimately it became clear he was talking about RSA, the asymmetric cryptographic cipher. And the fact that a full professor could deliver a keynote and get such basic terminology wrong has lived rent-free in my head for 2 decades. So that's the cause of my nerves, if I have them. I don't want to make any SRA-style mistakes in this talk. But let's see how it goes. So currently I'm the CTO of a security product company called Thinks Canary. We're a South African company, and we make the world's best honeypot. But a long time ago, I worked at SensePost, actually, a company that I think needs no introduction here. And in fact, it was so long ago that I was there the first time SensePost got sold, and they've obviously had a bunch of sales. And it was also when they still ran their own mail server and DNS server at blowfish.sensepost.com. So my background is security consulting, security product development, and applied research consulting. I've presented at a few conferences, written some papers and book chapters, but a lot more code. And now I run our engineering team. The years do pass quickly, and that means that my position from time to time involves younger folks coming to me and asking for advice on what they should do in their careers. Should they continue studying? Where should they apply? Is this even a good field to step into? And honestly, I hate giving advice. My advice is don't ask for advice. I think you can poll folks for their thoughts, but ultimately somebody else cannot tell you what to do. Their conditions and their constraints and their context doesn't match yours 100%. They don't carry any of the costs if that advice is bad. So in this talk, I'm not going to give you any advice, and you shouldn't treat anything that I say here as advice. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that we've tried. I'll tell you what we've seen succeed and some of the things we've seen flounder. And I'm going to refer to some foundational shifts in my own understanding of computing and cybersecurity through the time. And we're going to talk quite a lot about metaphors. But first, indulge me as I talk a little bit about some of these foundational shifts in my own understanding of computing. I don't think it's a stretch to say that for many of us, we were attracted to computing by its deterministic, algorithmic nature. A program has a strict sequence of steps that it follows to give you these amazing outputs. And even within that predictability, we can have randomness, we can have non-determinism, but it's constrained. We can control the machine. We know that we can take one program, run it on different machines, maybe even different architectures, and it still gives us that same result. Mark Andreessen said that software is eating the world, and that's because it's perfectly replicable. We can copy this program around, and it always functions the same. It produces the same result. Except not always. Software is an abstract concept. To make it real at some point, it has to run on real physical silicon, and that silicon is prone to failures. This is one of my favorite papers in recent years, which did shift some thinking for me. It's a paper out of Google, and it documents a phenomenon in which, at Google scale, they identify CPU cores which produce the wrong numeric calculation for individual inputs on that core. These mercurial cores, as they call them, passed all their tests, and they were certified by the chip fabs as being perfectly fine. But for individual numeric inputs, these cores would sometimes produce the wrong result. Now, obviously, those inputs would differ per core. The point here is that tiny, unpredictable imperfections in the physical manufacturing of individual cores meant that they would pass all tests, but they were still not fully reliable. I really love this paper. For me, it firmly ties the unpredictability of the real world, and it shifted my thinking from infallible to very fallible machines. Legendary Donald Knuth famously included these lines beneath some code he had written in a letter. Beware of bugs in the above code. I've only proved it correct, not tried it. Now imagine trying that correctly proved code, but on one of those mercurial cores, and wondering why it failed. Of course, it's exceedingly unlikely that at any point in your career you might encounter a mercurial core. It's probably not going to happen, but the next time you try a Google search and it fails unexpectedly, maybe it was your machine, or maybe it was a Google server, or maybe it was a router along the way that experienced one of these kinds of glitches. The software we use isn't a purely abstract mathematical concept, no matter how much we wish it was so. It's a real-world machine with oil leaks and unexplained vibrations. There's a second bit of Google research which actually excites me, and it's a blog post, but I am expecting it to produce a bunch of papers. It's not even 2 months old at this point, and here's the fascinating gist. Prior to 2019, for Google Android, they did most of their systems programming in C and C++, and they had a continual stream of memory safety bugs in Android. So starting in 2019, they began to use Rust for systems programming. And the results are, I think, quite profound. What they expected was to see a gradual linear drop-off in the bugs and memory safety bugs over time as they introduced more Rust into Android. But in fact, what they saw was this exponential drop-off in memory safety bugs. Now, the takeaway here is not that we should be using Rust specifically, because while that might be true, you'd be missing the bigger point. The bigger point is this: bugs have half-lives. Most bugs occur in new code. The probability that a piece of code has no bugs climbs exponentially the longer it has been in use. So one way to think intuitively about bugs is that the longer a bug has been present in a piece of code, the more likely it is that someone somewhere would have triggered the conditions necessary for that bug to show up. So if you have a piece of code that hasn't shown any bugs and it's been running with lots of inputs for a long time, you can be you can really rely on that code. And so I think it says something profound about our ability to protect code. Maybe we only need to worry about new code going into our code bases, and we don't have to worry so much about this huge mass of legacy code that exists. Now, of course, it doesn't say that there's no bugs in old code, but it does give us some way to tackle this problem of massive code bases. And I love the fact that we're so early in our evolution of this field that ground-shaking results like this are released as blog posts. In fact, Dan Geer makes this point repeatedly. In the terminology of the US government, cybersecurity is an occupation. It's not a profession. A few minutes ago, a bunch of you self-identified as professionals. Well, according to the US government, you're not. And I am extremely receptive to this view. The point here is that the rate of change in knowledge in our field is too rapid to be considered a profession. I'm not claiming it's easy to do our work. That's not what profession means here. But I am agreeing with the idea that we don't have anything close to professional standards. Compare this to recognized professions like law or accounting. The principles of accounting don't change from year to year or even decade to decade. You can take a contract lawyer from one firm, transplant them into another firm, and they can quickly continue to draw up contracts. These are professions. They have standard ways of working. But at this time, the security world changes too fast for professional standards to have set in. And unfortunately, I think it means we become focused on the next trick, the newest cuteness. We don't consider the context of the work that we do, and we might struggle to articulate why the work is interesting and challenging beyond saying something like, I like to hack. And I don't think that's enough. For a while, I've articulated my own interest in security as it's a human versus human field. It's inherently adversarial. when I was a consultant, we were trying to break in and somebody was trying to keep us out. Conversely, now as a product vendor, other people are trying to break into our stuff and we're trying to keep them out. But I still don't think that's enough to capture the attraction. It needs deeper analysis into how we think about security. As humans, we think in metaphors. They shape the way that we view the world. To give you an example, as children, we're taught the principles of electricity through electrical circuit, or we're taught the principles of electrical circuits through analogies. There are a few analogies that no doubt you would have seen as kids. There's a water model and the marbles and chains and so on. And in 1983, Gentner and Gentner, two academics, did some research in which they showed that the understanding of students' understanding of basic electronic circuits was very much varied depending on which model they were taught. The students reasoned from the analogy that they were shown, and it led to incorrect results. You might have been shown the marbles or chains in a tube example to explain electrical current, but it leaves very large gaps in your understanding. And there's a bunch of work in this vein. If you simply use the metaphors and analogies you've been taught, your thinking is going to be constrained and shaped by them. In understanding electrical circuits, one must fairly quickly move past the analogies and grapple with the weirdness that is electricity directly, or alternatingly, I guess, depending on your current type. As another example, when we talk about power distribution networks, if you're uneducated like I am, you might think only of electricity. However, during the Industrial Revolution, power distribution around factories was done through line shafting, a series of pulleys, shafts, and belts that distributed power from a central steam engine or some other power source out to the machines that used it. So power distribution is about moving energy from where it's created to where it's used. It could be a copper wire or it could be belts and shafts. By contending with my built-in idea that power distribution only relates to electricity, additional ideas of power distribution become visible when you look for them. Pneumatics, steam, hydraulics, they're all forms of power distribution used around plants, but also on individual pieces of equipment. You have to wrestle with the metaphors you rely on. My colleague Azza, who is much smarter than I, is fond of repeating George Box's aphorism that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Models in this case are metaphors. They won't completely capture the truth, but they help us draw a comparison to things we already know. Some of these help us, and unfortunately, some of them get in our way. Let's think about some of these. How do we see our work in cybersecurity described, and how do we describe our roles in this work? Up front, I asked you which team you worked on, right? Are you on team offense or defense? And it's super common in security for us to describe the work in these terms. But is it representative of the truth? Like, let's wrestle with this for a little bit. Where else do you hear talk of offensive team and defensive team? Anyone? American football, right? In professional American football, as you might know, the entire team is swapped out depending on the state of the game. Players on the offensive team never play a defensive role and vice versa, except on turnovers, but that's rare. A strict categorization of players makes sense, but I fear in security, we've fallen into reusing this metaphor, which doesn't map to the work that we do. Pen testers who break into applications also make recommendations to fix them, and sometimes they also fix them. And in some cases, or similarly rather, consultants who assist in securing cryptographic designs need to be well versed in ways that those systems fail. And this requires experience in breaking them. Paul Kocher, all right, cryptographic genius, I guess. He built SSL and TLS. He pioneered side channel attacks. He was involved in Spectre. You can engage him as a consultant to help you build cryptographic systems on the defensive side. So, like, where does he sit? Team offense or defense? He doesn't categorize himself in either. The folks who make evil jinx, are they offensive or defensive? Well, I mean, such tools clearly are used by malicious actors to compromise organizations, so offense. But it's also used by internal security tools to find out those users who are most at risk of phishing. So it's a defensive tool. All right. Mark Dowd's Azimuth Security created an iPhone exploit. They sold it to the FBI, who used it to unlock the iPhone belonging to a terrorist suspect. Offense in the pursuit of defense. I'll note that you don't hear militaries talking about team offense and team defense as two separate units. And I hate military analogies in cybersecurity in general. So for me to say this, I feel strongly. They train for both. Sometimes you need to defend a position. Sometimes you attack a position. That depends on the strategy. Now, it's true, red team and blue team are terms that do come out of the military, but those are very much training terms for the US military. It's not a permanent designation that you are always on red team, always on blue team. It's a role you take on depending on that training exercise. So we've cribbed this terminology and it's hampered us. It's much more accurate to say that we cybersecurity practitioners embody both offense and defense. We've tried to patch it up with this term purple teaming, but I think that just muddies the waters. My point should be clear. Dividing your work into which team you're on limits what you see in your bailiwick. When you start to think about the metaphors we use, sports analogies are not the only poor ones. You'll also sometimes hear that the movement in attention between client-side and server-side exploits gets described as pendulums, seesaws, or roundabouts. And while it's true that there is a change in time over the typical kinds of software targeted by most attackers, a pendulum or a seesaw is a terrible metaphor to use. It has two extremes. Those extremes are known and it moves smoothly between them. Actual exploitation is anything but. The late 90s and early 2000s, saw a focus on server-side exploits. The growing number of connected users in the 2000s meant client software or browsers were targeted, but it also led to a massive rise in phishing, which isn't the same kind of client-side exploit. So that pendulum is kind of like trying to shift off its path there, and either you really have to stretch your metaphor or discard it. And if we keep looking at our metaphors, there is another one that we use often, which I do kind of like, and I suspect most of you have heard of it. John Lambert wrote, "Defenders think in lists and attackers think in graphs." And we grab onto this idea with both hands. For now, let's ignore the obvious embedding in his statement that there's the stark difference between an attacker and a defender. Let's consider his idea on its own merits. I think the metaphor does help us explain some parts of the nature of attack to a point. Attackers do work to step around the obstacles in their path. In finding weaknesses, they're identifying the various places in the system that can be chained together to yield access that's more than the sum of its parts. On the other hand, people charged with defending networks or software typically do use checklist approaches. Do we have a firewall? Do we have EDR? Are we preventing SQL injection? Are we applying patches regularly? All yes, well then we must be safe. Except, of course, when you get taken through your HVAC vendor like Target was a few years ago now. The metaphor helps us think about the world, this one of graphs and lists, but it's not completely true. I'll call back to Paul Kocher. He's clearly a defender, but he's incredible at thinking up new attacks. And we don't expect metaphors to completely apply to every situation. The danger is in thinking that they're prescriptive. In Lambert's defense, I don't think he means it as such. Almost always when people quote him, they leave off the final part of his statement, which is, as long as this is true, attackers win. He doesn't assume it's inevitable that defenders always think in the same way. This saying succinctly captures individual attacks, but I think it fails to capture the dynamic aspect that's present in our ecosystem and the diversity of the players. Hosts you previously had access to, well, maybe they get taken offline. While this attack is ongoing, maybe new hosts are commissioned. The release of exploits changes the risk calculus, which I'm going to touch on. And as I've shown, the current cybersecurity landscape cannot be divided neatly into just attackers and defenders. Whole new categories of malicious actors will appear, and sometimes they disappear. Scattered Spider is an example here. They're a group of young folks. They don't have old school hacking skills, but they can imagine new paths because their view of dependencies surpasses that of most protectors. They live in a cloud-centric world where they can leverage simple techniques like SIM swaps, MFA bypasses, and phishing to wreak incredible damage because they understand service integration second to none. On the other hand, hacktivism has largely disappeared, right? We don't hear about hacktivism except in the support of international conflict. It's not just actors, though. We see exploits spawn, throwing paths into disarray. The Log4j vulnerability appeared out of nowhere from the Minecraft community, and it caused absolute havoc for several weeks, and then it star faded. But it's not always predictable as to what's going to cause that sort of impact. Stage Fright was released for Android with great concern. It was CVSS2 10.0, for goodness sake. But it had no real impact on the world, and it largely passed us by. On the other hand, the 2023 MoveIt vulnerabilities and the Ivanti vulnerabilities continue to echo even until today. Binary choices, metrics, and simple graphs aren't sufficiently broad enough to describe what's going on. I think we need a better metaphor to help us understand the situation. For me, I think about it as a space filled with bodies who exert different forces on each other. These bodies move through the space on paths that are naturally affected by almost gravitational forces between them. And I'm using very clearly a physics analogy here to explain the seeming randomness of cybersecurity, because there's some intuition we already have built up around the chaotic behaviors that we see in physical celestial bodies. In using this analogy, I think there are a bunch of different kinds of bodies. The bodies could be actors, such as malicious actors like commercial or state adversaries, but they could also be friendly or benign actors like Marcus Hutchins, who changed the path of WannaCry by registering a single domain, or practitioners who hack their paying customers to make them safer. All of these are bodies in the system. In physics, and I must confess, I am not a physics person, so if there's going to be an SRA-style moment, it's now, all right? But n-body problems are those where, given a set of orbiting bodies in space, along with their position, velocity, and time, for trying to predict the future movements, the problem is, can we predict the future movements of these bodies? And for 3 or more bodies, it cannot be done analytically. We can't run some maths and predict the future path of that body. So it's really hard. You have to, as I'll show, simulate it. Because in that system, if you imagine one body moving, right, and there's a bunch of other bodies around it, their gravitational forces are affecting the path of this body. You cannot just say it's moving along this path, so in a year it's going to be over here. Maybe something else has moved closer towards it in that time, and it will have pulled it off that path. So this dynamic aspect of n-body problems is, I think, quite attractive. So we'll look at a couple of simulations here. On the top one, you've got a system with a single body only, and you can tell exactly where it's going to go. You know where it's going to go. You can predict it now, a year from now, 100 years from now. The bottom one is a 2-body problem, and that actually is a little bit easier to, well, that is at least tractable. There is some maths you can do on that one, and you can predict where those bodies are going to be. I do give a shout out to Andrew McNutt, who wrote the simulator that I have cribbed and used for these demos. But with 3 or more bodies, we can't predict where they're going to wind up. You can, in your mind, try and predict where you think those are going to go, but you're not going to get it right. And while it might look like there's some stability in the orbits, they quickly decay into these seemingly random paths. Given a set of bodies and their current properties, the future paths can only be predicted by simulating the entire system. That's the only way we can tackle these. We simulate the system. We can't just run some analytical maths and compute a number. And of course, these simulations become subject to calculation errors. I think n-body systems make an excellent metaphor for cybersecurity. In using this analogy, the bodies are not just actors, though. They're also the systems and networks that occur within your visible online universe. And at times, well, it's also software, and you'll see at times bodies spawn in your online universe. Someone installs something new or they take something away. And security folks typically don't like huge, diverse software installations because we think of it in terms of increased threat surface. But we can also think of it as a way of adding chaos and unpredictability to our paths. And at the same time, exploits are third-party software that spawn randomly into our universe, and again, at unpredictable times, and they change your paths dynamically. Intuitively, we know that exploits change the risk calculus. Vulnerable software without an exploit exerts little force on the other bodies. But once you add an exploit for that vulnerability into that system, all those active paths are immediately affected. Unfortunately, and this really does suck, the existence of the exploit is often not known to all actors. And it, in this sense, behaves, if we're really going to stretch the metaphor, like hypothetical dark matter. Dark matter is the most widely accepted explanation for gravitational effects that we can see in our universe, but we can't explain through the mass that we know is there. And we can't view it, but we can detect its effects on the celestial objects. In the same way, a host's path may be changed when a 0-day is discovered, even though the host's owner doesn't know it at that stage. I'll also note, and this is just sort of a happy coincidence, when I showed you that 2-body problem, a 2-body problem is solved by breaking it up into 2 separate 1-body problems. And there's something there about cybersecurity in which the way that we secure our systems is the best way we know is to isolate them. Right? We break them up, and then that thing becomes tractable when it's a system by itself. In real n-body systems, the paths of objects are chaotic. Their small perturbations in the paths can have wildly different downstream effects on the paths of the body. In this simulation, there's 2 demos. The only difference is the top one, the green dot started at x coordinate 300, and the bottom one, it's 301. One tiny single pixel difference, but watch how different the behavior is. You can't, from what I take from this, you can't observe one system and then make predictions about what's going to happen in another system, in cybersecurity in particular, because these paths have small changes, but they can have dramatically different outcomes. I think we do see this all the time. In some other physical engineering fields, you can often predict where this field is going to be in a year from now. In cybersecurity, we can't predict where we're going to be in weeks to months. Here's the trouble though. Your n-body system is unique to you. You can't look at others and assume that because they largely overlap in market and installed tooling, that your risk is the same. These chaotic paths, as I said, are extremely susceptible to these small differences. And in this, again, this is another one with, it's just more bodies. There was just a single pixel difference. And they do, while there appear to be some structure, you'll notice that actually they are wildly different. So 2 organizations can appear to have identical defenses, but one maybe minted a site certificate for some site that they didn't expect to go public. The hostname got put into the certificate transparency logs. An attacker can discover the site, and the other organization didn't. That's a tiny difference. But as pen testers, we know those are the sorts of things that we rely on. And at the time, we think, but how can it be so significant? You know, at Thinkst, we underwent a phishing assessment a little while back, and one of our team opened up the Lure document, right? And, you know, the enable content button, like hitting that button leads to a very different outcome from closing the document. That's a tiny difference in the path, and it can have a major outcome. So how is it helpful to reframe cybersecurity as an n-body problem? What's the point in trying on this new metaphor? Well, I find it useful in 2 ways. Firstly, I don't think about our work in terms of binary choices. Sometimes we build tools that help defend networks, and sometimes we build tools that test defenses. Ultimately, we protect. And we do that by identifying the bodies that are ours to protect, and then recognizing that we can dramatically change their paths by small administrative actions like adding or removing software or configuration choices. These alter the forces between the bodies, and a deft touch can have a major impact. Sysadmins know this intuitively. A blocked port or a disabled feature goes incredibly far in preventing compromise. And again, that's such a small change. Secondly, it cements the world as being in flux. Just because you were secure this time last year doesn't mean you're still secure, whatever that means, today. Even if nothing has changed in your posture, an exploit could have spawned in the intervening time. Thinking with this n-body metaphor means you constantly have to look around and see where your path has taken you, which bodies are nearer and which are now further away. Thinking about security as an n-body problem does more, in my view, to explain the stochastic nature of compromise. It does more to explain it than the other analogies that we have. But I do return to boxes. All models are wrong, but some are useful. The map is not the terrain. As useful as this n-body system metaphor is, it's still not reality, and it cannot carry the full load of predicting your future. But for me, it helps make sense of our chaos better than the other metaphors. It's also a model I think you can apply to life. I landed in this career straight out of university because on the same day I emailed my CV to 2 companies. One was SensePost, the other one was a network hardware company, and one of those companies responded, right? And you can guess which one it was. But with a small path perturbation, I might be speaking at a network hardware event today. On the other hand, maybe I'd still wind up in security. The beauty of this is there's no way to get a do-over. Because within n-body systems, given the current state of the system, just like we can't predict where it's going in the future, we can't predict what happened in the past. We have to simulate the past. And to do that, you have to know all the forces that were in play. And for us as humans, there's a bunch of hidden influences that we don't know about. It doesn't only apply to individuals, though. It also applies to organizations. I like to think at Thinkst, we've been successful since our early definition of success was simply don't die. That was going to be success for us. 14 years later, we're not dead, so I think we've been successful. And something like 90% of companies will close their doors within 10 years of opening them. So we do feel incredibly fortunate. And I've got too much ego to say it's just pure luck that got us here. We did make some good calls, but I can also say that there were a bunch of moments where, in hindsight, we made what seemed at the time to be small decisions, but that had quite a large downstream effect. It could be things like early sales where the people were not really, their organizations were at a maturity that they shouldn't really have been buying from us, but they took a chance. And some of those folks are still our current customers. And so looking back at some of the calls that we made, I don't think these were the sole reasons for us still being around, but I do think they contributed. And they were both technical and non-technical bodies in the Thinkst N-body space that shaped our path. The first one that I'll talk about on the non-trivial side is customer focus. Without a shadow of a doubt, this played a big role in our not dying. So many product vendors lose sight of the fact that other people are handing their money to you, right? Like, that's a big thing. And they have an expectation that you're going to deliver on what you promised. And it seems simple, just deliver on what you promised. And it is simple, but it's hard. It's really hard to maintain that in every customer interaction. It's hard not to lapse into acceptance of lazy emails. It's hard to stress over the word and position of every new UI element and not simply accept as a developer the review that's in front of you. Every day is a new day to keep fighting for your customers and keeping them happy, and to not drop the ball. One path we've seen other startups follow once they get funding is they metastasize into a sales organization. We don't do outbound sales, but we didn't plan on not doing outbound sales as much as we tried other options and fell into this one because this fitted our values better. And I'm proud that we've maintained an engineering culture and haven't fallen into a sales-driven one. That customer focus brings new customers and it retains old ones. Another unexpected factor, I think, for our success was a 3-minute demo, right? It's a very specific thing here. Although it's hard to measure and gauge exactly what the influence was. We spend months fine-tuning a demo that walks a potential customer through all the features of our product in 3 minutes. And it instantly hooks people. They see the point, they get the value, and they make a purchase decision immediately. And when I, as a CTO, sit in on a vendor call where somebody's trying to sell us software, if they are not able to show me value in a short period of time, I start to become distrustful because either I think they're trying to bamboozle me, or I think they don't know their product, which is actually worse. It should be possible to highlight the major features of your product in a short demo. For us, it convinced purchasers. Now, no retrospective is going to be complete without a comment on the people that you have. And like, this one is a kind of a trite one, but there's so much randomness in who gets hired, where, and when. If this universe did get a do-over, we'd arrive at things with a different set of people, and I think would be much worse for it. For example, Azza joined us because I'd given a guest lecture at UCT, and I only landed that lecture because I mailed someone. If I didn't take the chance in mailing them, no Canary in its current state. Nick joined, and Nick is the current head of our product team. He joined because I knew him personally, and I wasn't comfortable to reach out to him, but I took that chance. And if I stayed in my comfort zone, no Nick, no head of our current product team. Similar small moments played out with the early folks from our team, Matt, Jason, Max, and Anna. All these little small moments combine to produce the core of our team. Then another factor for us, weirdly, is hardware, right? And when Harun mentioned that we should, or suggested we build honeypots, I thought he was mad. But we went along with it. And at the time, we picked this hardware form factor. Now, this was in 2014. Keep in mind, 5 years before that, in 2009, we had Nick and myself, a different Nick, had done a talk on cloud security, and we were talking about this forthcoming paradigm shift to the cloud. And here we were 5 years later saying, well, let's build an appliance based out of hardware. Like, why would we pick that? Well, this was somewhat intentional because we wanted to make deployments simpler. We'd seen the pain in getting tools for the security team into an organization, and if it required the participation of infrastructure teams, they weren't like they battled. If we could give them something simple to deploy, they'd be more likely to take it. And so hardware gave them that deployment route. Later on, we expanded into other platforms, but that hardware still proves to be very popular for the same reason: simpler deployments. Then when we started with Canary, we made this decision to go with Python as our implementation language. It's not a fashionable language now, and it certainly wasn't then. But that's not what the decision hinged on. We wanted a rapid development, memory-safe language with a large library ecosystem and a good networking support. And Python ticked all those boxes. Now, the criticism of Python typically is that it's not performant. And we sort of sit in this very fortunate spot in which performance is just not a consideration for us on the honeypots. In regular performance of honeypots, they don't interact with anybody. Nobody's sending traffic to those honeypots. It's only once the network has been compromised and an attacker is inside and is then sending traffic to the honeypot that we actually need to do anything. And even at that point, an attacker's first attack on a honeypot is not going to be, well, I'm going to spam you with like thousands of connections a second. That's not how it works. So we sort of, in a sense, got a little bit lucky here, but it is sort of one of the attributes of honeypots. So performance isn't a consideration. Memory safety certainly is, and Python played a big role in us moving quickly. Another early technical decision we made that has paid off time and time again is the use of DNS to communicate from the honeypots to their cloud console. Every canary sends its alerts to the cloud console. It fetches configuration data from the cloud console, and it fetches its settings from the cloud console and updates via DNS. And not canary appliances. Think of other corporate network appliances that communicate to cloud stuff. They're either going to be talking HTTP or MQTT to send data out of the network. What does that require? That requires you to poke firewall holes, get other people involved. What does that mean? Slower deployments, more friction. We wanted to avoid that. And so in the previous work we had as pen testers, we were well used to tunneling data in and out of networks. DNS is great for that. And so we built a DNS tunneling channel, which we've poured at this point person years into making a secure and reliable channel for our birds to do all of their actions. Now, the first version didn't use DNS. It relied on syslog. But we decided that was a terrible idea, and we built that initial DNS channel in a couple of days. And it has played a significant but largely silent role in our success because it's made these deployments simpler. Combine it with the hardware, we give people a unit in which they can plug it into almost any network. If it can get DHCP and can resolve a host name, you've got a working canary on your network. And so a 2-minute install is now what people get. But please don't see this as a sales pitch. I'm not here to drum up sales. My point is that Canary's success in hindsight was influenced by a bunch of these factors, and some of them we had an inkling about, some of them shaped us, and some of them were just blind luck. Our hardware vendor released an updated board 1 month before our first Canary shipped to customers, and we could get hold of those boards. And that board had full backwards compatibility with the first revision. We didn't expect that random hardware spawn into our universe, but it made a difference for us because we could ship boards to our customers that would have no performance issues whatsoever. You know, the first rev, it's like, okay, this thing is a little slow, but we'll kind of work with it. And then this new board shipped and suddenly it's like, yeah, this is great. Customers, they're going to love it. And so there was some dumb luck which benefited us. Lastly, our research background has played an indelible role in the development of Canary. In Think's N-body system, research and experimentation has exerted a massive gravitational effect on the paths of our people and product. I'm going to explore this a little more because I think it's applicable beyond Thinkst. At SensePost, my view is that the security and research put out by SensePosters also has played a major role in the longevity and success of that company. And I think that's true for a bunch of the other pen testing firms that have this long success. I think you can generally point to good research output. When we in the security industry conduct research, we use the term far more loosely than academics. And while it absolutely includes new threat models, vulnerabilities, and exploits, security research, as we think about it, also includes reading man pages, right? And I say this without judgment. Man pages are a great resource. But when I talk researcher, I'm specifically talking about that which adds to the body of knowledge. The downside is that sometimes that body of knowledge has compartments and parts of it are not open to the public. That's especially true for product companies, but it's also true for consulting companies because they are going to hold on to tricks and tools that they've built internally. The gravitational effect of good research is visible, I think, in several examples. First, as a young company, we published a series of research summaries and analyses we call Thinkscapes. And putting these research reports out had the twin benefit of introducing our company as a group of folks who could think analytically about security, but it was also content marketing before that term was widely used. Azza, who was, I've mentioned him already, but he was our first real engineering hire. One of the things that convinced him to join us is he read some of our Thinkscapes and he liked what he saw. A bunch of our early Canary customers were also Thinkscape's readers. Secondly, over the years, I've seen time and time again how new folks come into your orbit, or perhaps more accurately, you enter each other's orbits to avoid SRA mistakes, when standing up and presenting research at public events like this conference. If you didn't know Ivan, Jared, Ethan, Leon, Sitembile, Assad, Eli, Tswelopele, Ntando, and the two Johans, and Luis, well, you will by the end of today. The challenge naturally for them is to come away from the talk leaving a good impression with their audience. And if you can hit the mark, they'll remember you. Third, I believe research has gravitational mass which attracts further research. Folks working on obscure products or techniques know this feeling. You think there's something cool there, but it's hard to get other people's interest or attraction. I had nothing to do with any of this work. This was Etienne Stalmans and the team at SensePost. But from the outside, I think this is a good example because Etienne had to put together a bunch of blog posts and tools and talks before it garnered wider attention. My own research has spanned a bunch of topics, but without diving this deep into any of them. And one consequence of that is you rely on others to add mass to that research topic. And if nobody else does, well, then that area goes unexplored. Conversely, areas of research with lots of publications draw even more publications and research. Fourth, I think it's a factual statement that the accumulation of knowledge and research has the ability to modify the paths of people. I don't think that needs any further exposition, but I think it also heavily influences the paths of companies too. Internal research builds up mass, which directly impacts on the paths of the products that we build. I showed you the example of our DNS channel that came out of research we had done as pen testers, and we applied it into the product. Similarly, when the Log4Shell issue was published, we built a Canary token to help folks find those Log4j bugs quickly, based on an idea from someone called Florian Roth. Millions of log shell detections were created in a matter of days, and none of this was in a vacuum. We'd been running canarytokens.org for years at that point. We'd created it as a dependable resource. We'd been responsive to Florian before, right? So he has a reasonable expectation that we might assist when he proposes a Log4Shell token. And we'd experimented with lots of token types, so we were well versed in trying things out. And all of these contributed to the insane spike in that Log4Shell canary token as Log4Shell swept the internet. But here's the opposite side of it. I keep saying that paths can be altered and modified, and I do think research exerts a large force. However, it says nothing about whether the paths are altered in a good or in a bad way. There is such a thing as the wrong research. We see examples of research dragging products backwards, kind of like gravity wells pulling products towards the research done, not the product customers need. One of our competitors loves showing off a kernel module they built to instrument Windows systems. It's a technical marvel, but the product is still clunky and they don't have customers. Another competitor spent months building a hardware honeypot that included this fancy update mechanism. And in the end, they had a honeypot they could update, but they never pushed a single update because they had no customers. We've made missteps too. We've made 3 separate forays into on-prem solutions, trying different architectures. And in the end, we firmly closed the door on on-prem installations. But it dragged us backwards for several years. Impactful research is hard to predict, but in being part of several rounds of it, I've come to learn a few things. It takes more work than you think. Routinely, we put months of work into a single talk. The idea that you can whip up something in a weekend is a pipe dream for almost everyone. Folks who stop at the first result, or folks will typically stop at the first result because it's kind of fun and interesting, but they don't push higher. I recall a conversation we hired at some point a researcher and trying to explain my mindset to him, which is essentially that the first few levels of results in a research project are basically irrelevant. That my default stance for the first few findings is, it's not great. I did this to maintain motivation, but I could see a deep disconnect with this person though. They didn't see things in the same way. Now it's possibly an unhealthy attitude, I grant you that, but the outcomes make it worthwhile. In my view, there's no substitute for time and work. Keep at your research as long as you can. See if there's another angle you can tackle, a gap that you're glossing over, a sidebar that might yield a fresh new vein of results. Sweat the details of your presentation. Build a narrative, chase down references, code up demos, revise the presentation until just before you go on. I certainly did. Do the work. As I wrap this up, I want to encourage you to challenge the constraints that bind your thinking. Reflect on the metaphors that shape your curiosity and the work, your view towards the work that you do. I invite you to reuse this n-body metaphor to gain perspective on the seemingly chaotic world of cybersecurity, recognizing that our paths are affected by bodies unseen yet still with great mass. Your unique n-body problem can only be simulated by you. In the end, our very physical bodies rotate around, as Carl Sagan so memorably said, a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. We find meaning in relating to each other, to the things around us, and to what we do. Meaningful work can be found, it is to be found in cybersecurity. Expect and maybe even celebrate the chaotic paths that we weave. You can go further. You should go further. Thank you for your time.